The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Maria's modest home in northeast Portland, casting delicate patterns across the living room floor. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the air carried that peculiar autumn warmth that made children want to play outside until the streetlights came on. But 3-year-old Emma was perfectly content inside, sitting cross-legged on the worn but comfortable beige carpet, surrounded by her most prized possessions, a collection of plastic dolls with matted hair and faded clothes that had belonged to her mother before her. Emma hummed softly as she manipulated the dolls through an elaborate story that existed only in her vivid imagination. She was a talkative, precocious child, the kind of toddler who asked endless questions and narrated every moment of her day in breathless detail. Her mother, Maria, often joked that Emma's vocabulary exceeded that of many 5-year-olds. That morning, Emma had spent 20 minutes explaining to the mailman exactly how flowers grew, where butterflies went at night, and why the sky was blue but sometimes purple during sunsets. The mailman had smiled indulgently, charmed by her earnest curiosity. Maria was at work that day, a 12-hour shift at Portland Hospital where she'd been employed as a pediatric nurse for the past 5 years. Being a single mother meant constant juggling, constant sacrifice, constant worry about money. But Maria had made a promise to herself and to Emma that they would have a good life, that Emma would never want for love or security. So Maria worked her shifts, saved her money, and treasured every moment with her daughter. Emma's uncle Roberto had offered to watch her that afternoon. He was Maria's younger brother, and while he had his problems, troubles with his marriage, a hot temper that sometimes frightened Maria, he loved Emma fiercely. At least, that's what Maria had believed. Roberto had seemed stable enough when she dropped Emma off at noon, kissing her daughter's forehead and extracting a promise from her to be good for Uncle Roberto. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:47 p.m., though Emma didn't yet understand it as wrong. She heard Roberto's truck pull into the driveway outside, tires crunching on the gravel. But he wasn't alone. A woman's voice, shrill and angry, cut through the afternoon quiet. Emma recognized her aunt's voice, Roberto's wife, though they'd been taking time apart, as the adults said when they thought Emma wasn't listening. "You can't just disappear." His voice pierced through the front door before it even opened. "I know you've been seeing someone else. I know it." Emma's humming stopped. She looked toward the door, her small brow furrowing with confusion. The dolls fell from her hands onto the carpet. Roberto's response was low and angry, words Emma couldn't quite make out, but his tone sent a chill through her small body. She'd heard her uncle angry before. Loud arguments between him and her aunt had become increasingly common over the past months. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Don't you dare lie to me," screamed. The door slammed open so hard it crashed against the wall with a bang that made Emma jump. Stormed in, her face red, her hair wild around her shoulders. Roberto followed, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Not in front of Emma," Roberto growled, finally noticing his niece frozen on the carpet like a small, frightened rabbit. But it was too late, had already seen her. "Oh, don't you worry about Emma," shrieked, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm sure she'll love knowing what kind of man her dear uncle really is, a cheater, a liar, a coward." "Get out of my house," Roberto shouted, his voice so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Emma's heart began to race. She'd never heard him this angry. The safe, familiar space of her home suddenly felt hostile and unpredictable. Laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "Your house. I helped pay for this house. Everything in it is half mine, and I'm not going anywhere until you admit what you've done." What happened next occurred in a blur of chaos that Emma's 3-year-old mind could only process as terrifying fragments. Roberto grabbed his arm. She yanked away, screaming at him. He shoved her backward and she stumbled, crashing into the coffee table. The glass vase that held artificial flowers, flowers Emma loved because they never died, toppled over and shattered on the hardwood floor, creating a sound like a gunshot. Emma screamed, a small high-pitched cry of pure terror. "Emma, go to your room." Maria's voice wasn't there, but Emma obeyed an instinct deeper than conscious thought. She scrambled to her feet, but before she could move, Roberto and collided again, their bodies blocking her path to the stairs. Emma froze, trapped in the living room with two adults locked in a fury she couldn't understand. Grabbed a lamp, threatening to throw it. Roberto pushed her away. They both seemed to forget Emma existed as they hurled accusations and insults that the little girl didn't understand but felt in her bones. Emma's small body shook with sobs, but her voice was frozen in her throat. She couldn't cry out. She couldn't move. She could only stand there, watching the two people she knew transform into frightening strangers. Then came the sirens. The sound began in the distance, a wail that grew louder and louder until it filled the entire house, filled Emma's entire world. Roberto's face went pale. He and froze, separated by the wreckage of their violence. "I called them," said, her voice suddenly steady and cold. "I called the police." The sirens grew deafening. Emma covered her ears with her tiny hands, still unable to scream or cry or move. The world had become overwhelming, sight, sound, chaos, fear all crashing down on her simultaneously. Police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers shouted commands. One car pulled into the driveway with a different kind of authority. Through the window, Emma saw Officer emerge from his vehicle with Max, his Belgian, a massive dog with pointed ears, muscular shoulders, and an expression that looked frightening to a terrified 3-year-old. The front door flew open. Officers rushed in, their uniforms dark and authoritative, their voices commanding and sharp. "Police, don't move," one officer shouted. Roberto stood frozen, rushed toward the officers, still screaming. Officer brought Max inside to help secure the scene, to ensure no one made any sudden movements. The dog's barking was ferocious, protective, intimidating, everything a police dog should be. But to Emma, standing alone in the corner of the living room surrounded by the wreckage of her shattered afternoon, Max represented something else entirely. The physical manifestation of danger, of a world spinning out of control, of safety irrevocably broken. Emma watched as the dog lunged forward, barking at Roberto. She watched as officers tackled her uncle to the ground. She heard screams merge with Max's barking, and the officers' commands into one unbearable symphony of violence and chaos. And Emma, brave, curious, talkative Emma, opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She simply stood there, frozen in that moment, as something fundamental inside her fractured beyond repair. Maria was checking the vitals of a 6-year-old boy in room 412 when her phone began to buzz insistently in her scrub's pocket. She ignored it the first 3 times. Protocol was strict about personal devices on the pediatric floor. But then it rang. An actual phone call. Maria's hands froze mid-motion as she took in the caller ID, Portland Police Department. Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me," she said to her patient and his worried parents, forcing a smile that felt like a death mask on her face. She stepped into the hallway and answered with trembling fingers. "Ms., this is Officer Sarah with Portland PD. I'm calling about an incident at your residence. Your daughter is safe, but there's been a domestic disturbance involving your brother, Roberto. We need you to come to the station immediately." The hospital corridor seemed to tilt. Maria's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. "My daughter, where is my daughter? Is she hurt?" "She's physically unharmed, ma'am. She's being cared for by our victim advocate. But you need to come now." 15 minutes later, Maria was running through the police station, her nurse's badge swinging wildly from her neck, her dark hair escaping from its bun. Officer met her halfway, a compassionate woman in her 50s with kind eyes that somehow made everything feel worse. "Your daughter is in a private room," Officer said, guiding Maria through corridors lined with fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps. "She's been quiet since we brought her in. She hasn't said a word." Maria's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces with those words. Emma was sitting on a small chair in a room that tried too hard to be cheerful, with cartoon characters painted on the walls and shelves stacked with toys. But Emma wasn't looking at any of it. She was staring at her hands, her body curled inward like a snail retreating into its shell. When Maria burst through the door, Emma's head lifted slightly, and their eyes met. "Me," Maria whispered, dropping to her knees and pulling her daughter into her arms. Emma didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply allowed herself to be held, her small body rigid and unresponsive against her mother's chest. The victim advocate, a woman named, explained what had happened, had called 911 during the fight. Officers arrived to find Emma in the living room, visibly traumatized. Roberto was arrested at the scene, was treated for minor injuries. The house was now a crime scene, with photographs being taken, evidence being collected. "Has she said anything?" Maria asked desperately, still holding her daughter tightly. Shook her head slowly. "Nothing. Not since the officers arrived. The trauma can cause selective mutism in young children. It's a protective response. Her mind is essentially shutting down to cope with what she witnessed." Over the next 3 days, as Maria navigated the maze of the criminal justice system, she began to understand the true scope of the nightmare her family now inhabited. Roberto had been charged with domestic violence, reckless endangerment, and child endangerment. The charges carried serious penalties, potentially 5 to 7 years in prison depending on the outcome of trial. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was Sarah Mitchell, a sharp woman in her early 40s with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for prosecuting domestic violence cases with devastating effectiveness. Mitchell called Maria into her office on a cold morning exactly 1 week after the incident. "Your daughter is our most important witness," Mitchell said without preamble, gesturing for Maria to sit in the hard plastic chair across from her cluttered desk. "She was present during the entire altercation. She can testify about your brother's behavior, injuries, the sequence of events." Maria felt her stomach clench. She hasn't spoken since it happened, not a single word. Her therapist says it could take months for her to process. "I understand," Mitchell interrupted gently, but with an undertone of steel. "But we're facing a significant legal challenge. Your brother's defense attorney, James, is one of the best in Portland. He's going to argue that without Emma's testimony, the case relies too heavily on her account, which he'll portray as a scorned woman with ulterior motives. But was injured, there's physical evidence. Minor bruising, nothing that definitively proves your brother caused them, admits to being emotional, confrontational. A good defense attorney can spin that in his favor." Mitchell leaned forward, her expression serious. "We need Emma to corroborate her account. We need her to tell the jury what she saw." Maria stood abruptly, her chair scraping backward with a harsh sound. "She's 3 years old. She can't even speak right now. You want me to force my traumatized daughter to relive the worst day of her life in front of strangers?" "I understand this is difficult," Mitchell said, her voice softening slightly. "But there are legal procedures we can follow. We can request a hearing to assess whether Emma is capable of testifying, even in a limited capacity. We might be able to use alternative methods, video testimony, a closed-circuit arrangement, a child psychologist present." "Alternative methods," Maria repeated bitterly. "You mean exposing her to more trauma because the legal system needs her to perform?" "I mean," Mitchell said carefully, "that without her voice, a man who committed violence in front of a child might walk free, and he might do it again." Those words haunted Maria through the endless nights that followed. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small apartment where she and Emma had taken refuge with her sister, listening to her daughter whimper in her sleep, nightmares that had become a nightly occurrence. Emma's silence was absolute. She communicated through pointing, through nods and head shakes, through the occasional whimper of fear when unexpected noises startled her. The vibrant, talkative child Maria had known seemed to have vanished entirely. replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who flinched at shadows. A week later, Judge scheduled the hearing. The notice arrived in official court documents, and Maria read the words over and over, unable to process their meaning. Her 3-year-old daughter would have to stand before a judge and potentially convince him that she was mentally and emotionally capable of testifying about the trauma that had traumatized her into complete silence. The irony was unbearable. Maria consulted with Dr. Emma's new therapist, a kind woman with gentle eyes who seemed to genuinely care about Emma's rather than just viewing her as a case file. Doctor was honest about the risks. Forcing her to testify before she's ready could cause significant psychological damage, Doctor explained during a consultation in her office, which was decorated with soft colors and plants designed to feel calming. Her mutism is a symptom of trauma. It's her mind's way of protecting itself. The hearing itself could hurt. But if I don't pursue it, Maria said, her voice breaking, then my brother might get away with this. He might hurt someone else. He might hurt Emma again. That's the impossible choice they're forcing you to make, Doctor said sadly. There's no good answer here, Maria, only different kinds of pain. That night, Maria held Emma in her lap while her daughter slept, tears streaming down her own face. She whispered apologies to her sleeping child, apologies for a situation she hadn't created, for a system that seemed determined to sacrifice the innocent to satisfy legal procedure, for a world that was far too cruel for someone as small and fragile as Emma. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Maria had 3 weeks to find a way to help her daughter navigate the impossible. The first time Emma had a full-blown panic attack, Maria didn't recognize it for what it was. It was a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the incident, and they were at the grocery store. Emma was sitting in the child's seat of the shopping cart, usually her favorite place because Maria let her help pick out cereals and point at vegetables. But when a cart crashed into theirs from around the corner, a completely innocent accident, Emma's entire body went rigid. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her eyes rolled back slightly. Her small hands began to shake so violently that the box of crackers she'd been holding fell to the floor. A low, keening sound emerged from her throat, not quite a cry, not quite a moan, something primal and heartbreaking. "Emma, baby, what's wrong?" Maria dropped everything and pulled her daughter from the cart, cradling her against her chest. Emma's heart was racing so fast Maria thought it might burst through her ribs. Other shoppers stopped and stared. One older woman asked if she should call for help. For 10 minutes, Emma couldn't breathe normally. Her small body convulsed with silent sobs. She had cried so much in those early weeks that her tears seemed to have dried up, leaving only the physical manifestations of grief and terror. Maria carried her to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and held her daughter while she hyperventilated into Maria's shoulder. When Emma finally calmed down enough to be driven home, she fell asleep immediately, exhausted by her own body's betrayal. That night, Maria called Doctor and described what had happened. Doctor's response was gentle but grave. "She's experiencing panic attacks. They're a symptom of post-traumatic stress. The sound of the crashing cart likely triggered a flashback to the chaos and violence she witnessed. Her nervous system is in constant fight-or-flight mode." Fight-or-flight mode. Emma was 3 years old and her nervous system was broken. Doctor began twice-weekly sessions with Emma, and Maria attended most of them. The therapy room was intentionally designed to feel safe. Soft carpet, natural light, shelves filled with books and toys that could be manipulated without producing loud noises. But even in this sanctuary, Emma struggled. During their third session, Doctor introduced art therapy. "Sometimes children can express what they can't say in words through drawing," she explained to Maria, who sat in a small chair against the wall, watching her daughter with the intensity of a hawk. Emma was given a large piece of white paper and a box of colored markers. She stared at the blank page for a long moment, then reached for a black marker. Her small hand began to move across the paper in jerky, aggressive strokes. What emerged was chaos. Dark scribbles covered most of the page, layer upon layer of black and brown and dark blue. In the center were stick figures with open mouths, mouths drawn as harsh lines, eyes as dots of panic. One figure was significantly larger than the others, its hands drawn as angry zigzags. Another figure appeared to be screaming, though the drawing captured only the impression of sound without the sound itself. "That's very powerful, Emma," Doctor said softly. "Can you tell me about what you drew?" Emma's jaw clenched. She stared at the paper but said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the marker. Maria felt tears burning behind her eyes. This drawing was Emma's testimony, a visual manifestation of everything trapped inside her silent mind. The weeks progressed with agonizing slowness. Emma's selective mutism deepened. She stopped speaking not just to strangers but to almost everyone. She would whisper occasionally to Maria, usually late at night when her defenses were lowest, but even those whispers became increasingly rare. At preschool, her teacher reported that Emma spent most of the day sitting alone, watching other children play without joining them. Then came the school incident that broke Maria's heart into pieces she didn't know could be broken further. It was a Tuesday morning. Emma was in the preschool gym during a regular class, and the teacher had set up a DVD of children's music videos. The opening scene was brightly animated with dancing characters, but something in the sequence, perhaps the sudden loud noise, perhaps a scene that resembled conflict, triggered Emma's trauma response. She didn't scream or run. Instead, she simply disappeared beneath a table and refused to come out. When the teacher tried to coax her out gently, Emma began to rock back and forth, her eyes unfocused. The school called Maria, who arrived within minutes to find her daughter in a state of complete dissociation, unresponsive to her mother's voice or touch. It took 30 minutes for Emma to come back to herself, and when she did, Maria carried her home in her arms, where she slept for 3 hours straight. That evening, the school counselor called. There was compassion in her voice, but also concern. "We're wondering if it might be better for Emma to take a leave of absence from preschool. She's clearly not ready for a classroom environment right now. The stimulation is overwhelming her nervous system." Maria agreed, though it felt like another failure, another way the trauma was stealing pieces of her daughter's childhood. The nightmares became a nightly occurrence. Maria would be jolted awake by her daughter's screams, not words, just raw, anguished sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep in Emma's terror-stricken soul. Emma would wake up gasping, her small body soaked in sweat, her eyes wide with the remnants of whatever horrors her sleeping mind had conjured. "It's okay, baby, it's okay. You're safe," Maria would whisper, holding Emma until her breathing slowed and her daughter finally fell back asleep. But the reassurance felt hollow. Emma wasn't safe. Her nervous system didn't believe in safety anymore. Maria's own mental state began to deteriorate. She was exhausted, not just the normal exhaustion of parenting a young child, but a bone-deep weariness that seemed to affect her ability to think clearly. She'd stare at patient charts at work and have to read them 3 times before the words made sense. Her supervisor pulled her aside and gently suggested she consider taking medical leave. "You're stretched too thin," her supervisor said kindly. "You're a good nurse, Maria, but you can't pour from an empty cup." Maria took a leave of absence. It meant financial hardship. She was already struggling to cover therapy sessions and legal fees, but it meant she could be present for Emma in a way that her job wouldn't allow. The compulsory hearing was now only 2 weeks away. Doctor tried to prepare Emma, using simple language and play therapy. She'd use dolls to act out going to the courthouse, going before a judge, answering questions. But Emma would simply watch without responding, her expression blank, her eyes hollow. "Will it hurt?" Emma whispered one evening, the first real question she'd asked about the hearing. "No, baby. It won't hurt," Maria assured her, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Emotional pain couldn't be seen on an X-ray, couldn't be treated with a bandage or an antibiotic. What happened in that courtroom could wound Emma in ways that might never fully heal. One night, as Maria lay in bed beside her sleeping daughter, she allowed herself to break down completely. She sobbed silently, her shoulders shaking, her hand covering her mouth to muffle sounds that might wake Emma. She thought about Roberto, about a legal system that seemed determined to sacrifice her daughters on the altar of justice. She thought about the hearing, and she wondered, what would it cost to make her daughter speak? And more terrifyingly, what if, despite everything, Emma still couldn't find her voice? Assistant District Attorney Sarah Mitchell had been prosecuting domestic violence cases for 17 years. She'd put away dangerous men, protected vulnerable women, and built a career on understanding the intricate dance of abuse and trauma. But she'd never encountered a case quite like Emma's, and it was keeping her awake at night. It was a Friday evening, and Mitchell sat alone in her office surrounded by case files stacked in precarious towers. The city of Portland sprawled below her third-floor window, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the valley. The hearing was scheduled for 12 days away, and Mitchell was running out of options. The evidence against Roberto was solid but not airtight. His testimony would carry weight, but James, Roberto's defense attorney and one of the most skilled litigators in the state, had already filed motions to exclude certain evidence and impeach credibility. He would argue that was vengeful, that she'd orchestrated the police call, that her injuries were minor and could have been self-inflicted. Without Emma's corroboration, the case became a he-said-she-said scenario, and juries were notoriously unreliable in those situations. Mitchell pulled up her notes on Emma's psychological profile. Doctor had submitted a preliminary report indicating severe post-traumatic stress disorder, selective mutism, panic attacks, dissociation, and a nervous system that was essentially locked in a state of hypervigilance. The report made one thing abundantly clear: forcing Emma to testify in a traditional sense would likely cause significant psychological harm. Mitchell had a daughter. She was 8, bright and confident, living in a world that still felt fundamentally safe. Mitchell tried to imagine her child reduced to Emma's state, silent, terrified, broken, and the image made her chest tighten with something that transcended professional concern. She was reviewing doctors' recommendations, therapy, medication, time, safety, when her eyes snagged on a single word: triggers. The report discussed how sudden loud noises, unexpected movements, and certain visual stimuli could send Emma into a panic response or dissociative state. But it also mentioned something Mitchell hadn't initially focused on: adaptive responses. Doctor wrote that Emma had demonstrated moments of engagement when she felt genuinely safe, when the environment was predictable and controlled. Mitchell closed the file and stared at the blank wall of her office, thinking, what if they couldn't force Emma to speak, but they could help her feel safe enough to want to speak? The idea struck her like lightning at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. She immediately texted Officer, whose name appeared repeatedly in the incident report as the K-9 officer who'd responded to the scene with Max. Texted back within minutes. He was apparently awake too, and agreed to meet her first thing Monday morning. Monday came gray and cold. Was waiting in Mitchell's office when she arrived, still in his police uniform, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the frigid air. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of law enforcement, with kind eyes that suggested he genuinely cared about the work he did. "So you have a crazy idea," said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Mitchell's desk. "Possibly," Mitchell admitted. "I've been thinking about Emma, about her trauma response, about the fact that she witnessed a frightening incident involving a police dog, specifically your dog Max, and that experience has become part of what's traumatizing her." Nodded slowly, following her logic. "What if," Mitchell continued, her words coming faster now. We turned that trauma on its head. What if we used Max as a therapeutic tool to help Emma reclaim a sense of safety and agency? Not in a coercive way, but as a genuine therapeutic intervention. Set down his coffee. You want to use Max to help her face her fear. Exactly. If Emma can interact with Max in a controlled, supportive environment, if she can see the dog as a protector rather than a threat, it might help unlock something in her. It might help her feel safe enough to speak again. That's paused, clearly considering the proposal. That's ambitious and unconventional. The legal system being used against a 3-year-old is already unconventional, Mitchell said quietly. I'm trying to find a way to serve justice without destroying a child in the process. Was quiet for a long moment. I'd need to talk to my chain of command, and Max would need to be properly prepared. I can't just walk him into a courtroom expecting a traumatized child to suddenly overcome her fear. There are protocols, procedures. I understand, but would you be willing to try? Met her eyes and she saw the moment he made a decision. Yeah, I think I would. That little girl shouldn't have to choose between silence and further trauma. Over the next 3 days, Mitchell and worked together to develop a plan. They consulted with Doctor, who was initially skeptical but gradually came around to the idea. It's not a guarantee, Doctor said during their consultation, held in her office with the soft afternoon light filtering through half-closed blinds. And it could go wrong in ways we can't predict. Emma might become more traumatized if the intervention isn't handled perfectly. But it could also help, Mitchell countered. If it works, it could open the door to healing. It could, Doctor agreed, and that possibility is significant enough to warrant careful exploration. The question was how to convince Judge to allow such an unconventional approach. Mitchell scheduled a meeting in the judge's chambers, a space that always felt somehow more human than the formal courtroom, lined with books and photographs, with natural light from real windows rather than fluorescent bulbs. Judge, a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for fairness, listened to Mitchell's proposal with increasing skepticism. You want to bring a police dog into my courtroom, the judge said, her tone suggesting she'd perhaps misheard. Not into the courtroom initially, Mitchell clarified. Before the hearing, as a preliminary therapeutic intervention, the dog has been associated with Emma's trauma. If we can help her process that association in a controlled setting, with trained professionals present, it might help her feel safe enough to communicate during the hearing. Or it might terrify her further, Judge said, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. That's a risk we'd need to carefully manage, Mitchell acknowledged. But with Doctor present, with her mother present, with Officer providing clear structure and safety. This is highly irregular, the judge interrupted. Emma is 3 years old and hasn't spoken voluntarily in 6 weeks, Mitchell said quietly. The traditional approach isn't working, Your Honor. She's too traumatized to participate in the legal system as it's currently designed. This is an attempt to create an alternative pathway that doesn't sacrifice her on the altar of procedure. The judge was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. If we do this, she finally said, it will be entirely voluntary on the child's part. The moment she becomes distressed, it stops, completely. No pressure, no insistence. Agreed. Agreed, Mitchell said immediately. And it happens before the hearing, not as part of it. This is therapy, not testimony. Exactly. Judge sighed, a sound that contained both resignation and a glimmer of hope. All right, we'll try it. But if this traumatizes that child further, Assistant District Attorney Mitchell, I will hold you personally responsible. Am I clear? Crystal clear, Your Honor. That evening, Mitchell called Maria and arranged to meet with her at a coffee shop near the hospital. When Maria arrived, she looked like a woman held together by fraying strings, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a perpetually messy bun, worry etched into every line of her face. Mitchell explained the plan carefully, using language designed to convey both the potential benefits and the risks. "You want to expose my daughter to the thing that traumatized her," Maria said, her voice rising. "You want to make her relive that moment." "Not exactly," Mitchell said gently. "We want to help her reframe that moment, to show her that the dog itself isn't dangerous, that there can be safety even in situations that currently feel threatening. And if it doesn't work, if it makes everything worse, then we stop immediately. No pressure, no forcing her to continue. But Maria, I think about it this way. Emma is currently unable to speak, unable to process, stuck in a state of trauma. What we're attempting is to give her a tool to move past that trauma." Maria was silent for a long time, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. "I have to think about it," she finally said. "I have to talk to doctor, I have to. I need to do what's right for my daughter." "Of course," Mitchell said. "Take the time you need, but we only have 9 days before the hearing." That night, Maria sat on Emma's bed, watching her daughter sleep. She thought about the impossible choice before her. Push her daughter to face her trauma in hopes of healing, or let Roberto potentially walk free. There was no good answer, only different kinds of desperation. By the next morning, Maria had made her decision. She called Mitchell and said 2 words that would change everything. "Let's try." The day of the agreed-upon therapy session was scheduled for Wednesday. Maria had decided to tell Emma the night before, giving her daughter just enough time to process without letting the anxiety build to unbearable levels. But as evening fell on Tuesday and Maria prepared Emma for bed, she found herself frozen, unable to form the words that needed to be said. Emma was in her pajamas, soft pink ones covered in images of sleeping rabbits, when Maria finally gathered the courage. They were sitting on the edge of Emma's small bed, and Maria had just finished braiding her daughter's hair, a ritual they performed every night. Maria's hands were gentle, practiced, but her mind was turbulent with doubt. "Baby, I need to tell you something about tomorrow," Maria began, her voice carefully modulated to sound calm and reassuring despite the anxiety churning in her own stomach. Emma's body stiffened slightly. Even at 3 years old, she seemed to sense when adults were about to say something important or frightening. She looked up at her mother, her dark eyes, so like Maria's own, fixed and watchful. "Tomorrow, we're going somewhere special," Maria continued, speaking slowly and choosing each word with deliberate care. "We're going to a place where there are people who want to help you feel better." Emma's small hand reached out and gripped her mother's sleeve, a gesture that had become her primary way of communicating anxiety over the past weeks. "It's going to be okay," Maria whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "I'm going to be right there with you the whole time. The entire time, Emma. You won't be alone for even 1 second." "Who?" Emma's voice came out as barely more than a breath, a whisper so quiet that Maria had to lean in to hear it. It was the first question her daughter had asked anyone in weeks, and the sound of Emma's voice, thin and fragile as tissue paper but real, present, alive, sent tears streaming down Maria's face. "There's going to be a police officer," Maria said, carefully wiping her eyes so Emma wouldn't see her crying. "His name is Mr. He's a good man who helps keep people safe." Emma's grip on her mother's sleeve tightened. "And he has a dog, a very big dog named Max." Maria felt her daughter's entire body go rigid against her. Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid, the early warning signs of a panic attack. Maria immediately adjusted her approach, speaking with even more gentleness. "I know that sounds scary," Maria said, running her fingers through Emma's freshly braided hair in soothing strokes. "I know you remember Max from that bad day. But baby, I want to tell you something very important, and I need you to listen with your whole heart." Emma's breathing slowed slightly, enough that Maria knew her daughter was listening. "Max is a good helper," Maria said, using the same language doctor had coached her to use. He helps Mister keep people safe. And on that day when everything was scary and loud, Max was doing his job, trying to help, trying to keep people from hurting each other. He didn't mean to be scary. He was just trying to help. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Her small body remained tense, but she hadn't pulled away. "Will he hurt me?" Emma whispered, and the question broke Maria's heart all over again. "No, baby, no. Max is a good helper," Maria repeated, infusing her voice with absolute certainty even though uncertainty was eating her alive from the inside. "He's a gentle friend. Mr. loves Max very much, and Mr. is a good man who would never let anyone get hurt." "I don't want to go," Emma said, her voice becoming slightly stronger, more insistent. It was the most she'd said in weeks, and while the content was heartbreaking, the fact that she was speaking at all represented a small victory. "I know, sweetheart," Maria said, pulling her daughter into her lap, cradling her like she had when Emma was an infant. "I know you don't want to go, and it's okay to be scared. Being scared makes sense, but I believe in you, Emma. I believe that you're brave and that you can do brave things even when you're scared." "Will you hold my hand?" Emma asked. "Every single second," Maria promised. "Your hand won't leave my hand for even one moment. We'll do this together, okay? Me and you, just like we do everything together." Emma nodded against her mother's chest, but her body remained tense. Maria kept holding her, kept stroking her hair, kept whispering reassurances that she desperately hoped were true. Eventually, Emma's breathing deepened as exhaustion her anxiety. Maria carried her daughter to bed and tucked her under the soft purple blanket Emma loved, the one with stars embroidered across it. She lay down beside her daughter, spooning her small body, and remained there through the darkness. But neither of them truly slept. Around midnight, Emma woke with a whimper, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't articulate. Maria held her, rocked her gently, and whispered soothing words until her daughter drifted back into fitful sleep. This pattern repeated itself 3 more times through the night, Emma waking in distress, Maria comforting her, temporary peace before the cycle began again. By 5 a.m., Maria finally gave up on sleep. She slipped carefully out of bed, leaving Emma cuddled with her stuffed rabbit, and made her way to the kitchen. She put on coffee with shaking hands and sat at the small table that overlooked their modest apartment complex. Outside, the world was still mostly dark, the city not yet awake. Maria pulled out her phone and opened the Photos app. She scrolled through images of Emma from before. Emma laughing at the park, Emma covered in birthday cake, Emma singing with her mouth wide open, her entire body radiating joy and confidence, and the kind of unself-conscious freedom that 3-year-olds possessed. Looking at those photos now felt like looking at someone else's child. The girl in those pictures seemed like a completely different person from the silent, frightened ghost that Emma had become. At 6:30 a.m., Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, dragging her stuffed rabbit. She climbed into Maria's lap without speaking, and they sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, holding each other like survivors clinging to driftwood in an endless sea. "Are you still scared?" Maria asked softly. Emma nodded against her mother's chest. "Me too, baby," Maria admitted, deciding that honesty was better than false reassurance. "Me too, but we're going to be scared together, and that makes it smaller somehow." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly that Maria almost missed it, she whispered, "Okay." They bathed and dressed slowly, reverently, as if preparing for something sacred. Maria chose Emma's favorite dress, a soft pink one with tiny embroidered flowers, and braided her hair with extra care. She dressed herself in professional clothes, wanting to project calm authority even though she felt like she was fracturing from the inside. As they were leaving the apartment, Emma stopped at the door and looked up at her mother with eyes far too wise for a 3-year-old. "If I'm very brave," Emma asked, "will the bad thoughts go away?" Maria knelt down, holding her daughter's small face gently between her palms. "If you're brave," she said carefully, "you're going to feel better, Not all at once and not completely, but better. You're going to take back some of your power from the scary things, and that's a big, important thing. Okay, Emma said, her voice trembling but determined. I'll be brave. They drove through Portland in silence, Emma holding her stuffed rabbit and staring out the window at the city waking up around them. Maria kept one hand on her daughter's knee, a physical reminder that they were in this together. The courthouse loomed ahead, gray and imposing and filled with unknowns. Maria squeezed Emma's knee gently as she pulled into the parking lot. Here we go, Maria whispered, as much to herself as to her daughter. Neither of them was ready, but readiness, Maria was learning, was a luxury that life didn't always provide. The courthouse hallway was cold and sterile, lined with marble that echoed every footstep like a judgment. Maria and Emma walked slowly toward the designated room, Emma's small hand gripping her mother's with surprising strength. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, intimidating in its formal grandeur. Everything was designed to inspire respect and fear. The high ceilings, the official portraits of stern-faced judges, the American flag standing at attention in their corners. A woman in professional attire met them at the entrance to the waiting area. She introduced herself as the victim advocate, and her voice was warm and practiced in a way that suggested she'd done this many times before. She led them to a small private room rather than the main waiting area, a kindness that Maria appreciated deeply. Judge had made it clear that Emma's privacy and comfort were paramount. "How are we doing?" asked, kneeling down to Emma's level. Emma didn't respond, but she did look at the woman with cautious curiosity. "She's nervous," Maria said, running her fingers through Emma's hair. "We both are." "That's completely normal," said. "Judge is inside setting up. Officer and Max are in an adjacent room. We're going to take this very slowly, okay? If Emma needs to stop at any point, we stop. No questions asked." Maria nodded, grateful for the reassurance even though her own anxiety was reaching fever pitch. She could feel her pulse in her temples, could feel the tension radiating through her shoulders and down her spine. She forced herself to breathe deeply, knowing that Emma was acutely attuned to her emotional state. At 10:47 a.m. appeared in the doorway. "We're ready whenever you are," she said gently. Maria stood, and Emma immediately wrapped her arms around her mother's leg, clearly reluctant to move. "Come on, sweetheart," Maria said softly, scooping her daughter into her arms. "Remember what we talked about. We're going to be brave together." Emma nodded minimally, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand, her other hand reaching around to grip the back of her mother's neck. She buried her face in Maria's shoulder, preparing herself for what was to come. The room they entered was unlike anything Emma had experienced before. It was large and formal, with wooden paneling and high ceilings that made everything feel important and dangerous simultaneously. The judge's bench loomed at the front like an altar. There were tables, chairs arranged in specific configurations, and windows that let in pale morning light. The space smelled like old wood and furniture polish, institutional and cold. Judge sat behind her elevated bench, her gray hair pulled back severely, her expression compassionate but serious. She caught Maria's eye and gave a small nod of encouragement. The courtroom was largely empty, no curious spectators, no media circus. Judge had cleared the space specifically to protect Emma's privacy and minimize stimulation. Only essential personnel were present: the victim advocate, a court stenographer, and a few administrative staff positioned discreetly in the background. "Hello, Emma," Judge said gently, her voice carrying across the room in a way that made it clear she was a woman accustomed to authority. "I'm Judge. I'm so glad you could come visit my courtroom today." Emma didn't respond, but she lifted her head slightly from her mother's shoulder, peering at the judge with wide, uncertain eyes. "I know this is a strange place and probably a little scary," Judge continued, "but I want you to know that you're safe here. Your mother is here, and everyone in this room cares about you and wants to help you feel okay. Is that all right?" Maria felt Emma's small head nod against her shoulder. Good, Judge said. She then looked directly at Maria. Why don't you two walk over to that comfortable chair over there, the one with the cushions? Maria carried Emma to the indicated chair, a oversized armchair positioned in what seemed like the center of the room. She sat down carefully, keeping Emma in her lap, her arms around her daughter like a protective cocoon. Emma's heart was racing. Maria could feel it against her own chest, a rapid fluttering like a trapped bird. Now, Judge said, her voice dropping to an even gentler tone, I know that before you had a very scary experience. And in that scary experience there was a dog. Do you remember that? Emma's body went absolutely rigid. Her hand clenched around her stuffed rabbit so tightly that the fabric began to tear slightly. Her breathing became shallow. It's okay, Maria whispered in her daughter's ear. I'm right here, you're safe. Emma, Judge said, still in that careful, measured voice, there's someone I'd like you to meet. His name is Officer, and he has something very important to tell you. Is it okay if he comes over here? Maria felt her daughter's hesitation, the war between curiosity and fear playing out in Emma's small body. After a long moment, Emma gave the tiniest of nods. Officer emerged from the side door slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, which would have seemed intimidating if his expression weren't so carefully gentle. But it was Max who captured everyone's attention. The Belgian was massive from an adult perspective, and from a 3-year-old's perspective, he must have seemed like a small horse. He had the same coloring Emma remembered, tan and black markings, the same alert ears, the same powerful build. But Officer kept him on a short leash, and the dog's body language was completely different from what Emma remembered. Max wasn't lunging or barking. He was walking calmly, his tail hanging in a neutral position, his entire demeanor radiating discipline and control. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow. Maria could feel her daughter's entire body trembling. This is Max, Officer said quietly, kneeling down about 10 feet away from where Maria and Emma sat. He kept Max in a perfect sit-stay position beside him. Max is a police dog, which means he helps keep people safe. He's a very good boy and he's very smart. Emma stared at the dog with an expression that was a mixture of terror and fascination. The rabbit in her hands had stopped being a comfort object and had become instead something to grip, something to anchor herself to reality. On that day, Officer continued, his voice low and soothing, Max was doing his job. He was trying to help. He didn't mean to be scary. He was just doing what he's trained to do, help people who need help. Max shifted slightly and Emma flinched. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. Max is a good friend, Officer said. He doesn't hurt people, he helps people. And right now, he would really like it if you weren't scared of him because Max doesn't like when people are scared. It makes him sad. Emma was completely still now, her eyes fixed on the dog. Judge watched from her bench with an expression of profound compassion. The court stenographer's fingers remained poised over her keyboard, capturing every moment of this unprecedented proceeding. Officer reached down and gently stroked Max's head. See, Max likes gentle touches. He likes kindness. He's a very gentle boy, even though he's big. Maria could feel tears beginning to form in Emma's eyes. Whether they were tears of fear or something else, hope maybe, or the beginning of processing, Maria couldn't tell. She held her daughter, pressed a kiss to the top of her head and whispered, "You're doing so good, baby. So good." For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma stared at Max. Max, trained to remain calm and patient, stared back with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold no malice, only curiosity. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Emma extended one arm slightly, her small hand opening from the death grip it had maintained on her rabbit. Officer remained completely still, waiting, giving Emma all the agency and control in this moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The silence in the courtroom became almost unbearable, a thick, heavy silence that seemed to press down on everyone present. Emma's small arm remained extended, her fingers trembling visibly in the cool air of the formal room. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, the sound of a small animal caught in a predator's gaze, though there was no predator here, only a trained dog lying calmly beside his handler, waiting with the patience that only animals truly possessed. Maria could feel her daughter's heart racing against her own chest, beating so fast it seemed impossible for such a small body to contain such overwhelming fear. But she also felt something else, a subtle shift, a microscopic movement toward something beyond the terror. Emma's arm, though trembling, remained extended rather than retreating. Her eyes, though wide with panic, remained fixed on Max rather than seeking escape. "That's beautiful, Emma," Officer said softly, his voice like honey poured over warm bread, comforting and gentle. "You're being so brave. Max can see how brave you are and he thinks you're wonderful." Emma's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. A bead of perspiration formed on her small forehead despite the coolness of the room. Judge leaned forward slightly on her bench, her expression one of intense focus and compassion. The victim advocate had tears streaming silently down her face, one hand pressed against her mouth. "Emma," Officer continued in that same measured, soothing tone, "can you tell me something? Can you tell me what color Max is?" It was a simple question, perhaps too simple, deliberately so. It was designed to engage Emma's cognitive function, to pull her mind away from pure survival mode and into something approaching normalcy. But it required her to speak, and speaking meant crossing a threshold she hadn't crossed in 6 weeks. The seconds stretched like taffy. Emma's mouth opened and closed without sound. Her small hand wavered, still extended but beginning to shake more violently. "It's okay if you can't answer right now," Officer said quickly, sensing that he might be pushing too hard. "You don't have to say anything. You can just show Max with your hand if you want. Can you keep your hand out? Can you be really, really brave and just keep it there?" Emma's arm remained extended, though it was clearly taking enormous effort. Sweat had begun to form on her upper lip. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The stuffed rabbit had fallen from her grip and lay on the floor beside the chair, abandoned in the face of something more important, more urgent. Maria made a split-second decision. She loosened her grip on Emma slightly, not letting go, but giving her daughter a fraction more autonomy. She leaned her cheek against Emma's hair and whispered words that only her daughter could hear. "I'm so proud of you, so incredibly proud. You're the bravest girl I know." Something shifted in Emma's expression. The pure terror began to fracture, like ice starting to break apart in spring. What replaced it wasn't courage exactly. It was something more complex. It was the recognition that she might survive this, that her mother believed in her, that maybe, just maybe, the thing she feared most wasn't actually going to destroy her. Officer began to slowly, infinitesimally slowly, shift his position. He moved not toward Emma but slightly to the side, repositioning Max so that the dog was still visible but at a slightly different angle. He was giving Emma the chance to see Max from a different perspective, to gather data with her eyes that contradicted the data her traumatized nervous system had recorded from 6 weeks ago. "Max is waiting to be your friend," Officer said. "He's a very patient dog. He can wait as long as you need him to wait." Another minute passed. Emma's arm was shaking so badly now that Maria was worried her daughter might lose the ability to hold it extended. But Emma held firm, her small hand reaching toward something that represented everything she feared and everything she needed to overcome. Judge had removed her glasses and was quietly wiping her eyes with a tissue. The court stenographer had stopped taking notes and was simply watching, bearing witness to this small miracle of human resilience. "You know what Max likes?" Officer asked gently. "Max likes when people are calm. Max can feel if you're scared or calm, and he likes calm better. Can you try to take a big breath with me? In through your nose, out through your mouth." Emma's breathing had been so rapid and shallow that it bordered on hyperventilation. Officer's suggestion was both therapeutic and strategic. He was teaching Emma a coping mechanism while also helping her regulate her nervous system. Maria felt her daughter take a shuddering breath in through her nose, out through her mouth. Then another. Then another. With each breath, Emma's arm stopped shaking quite so violently. With each breath, her eyes seemed to focus a little more clearly on the dog before her. "That's excellent," officer said. "You're doing such a good job, Emma, such a good job." Emma took another breath, and this time something fundamental shifted. Her face, which had been locked in an expression of pure terror, began to soften. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile but an acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, this moment wasn't going to destroy her. "Can you tell me something else, Emma?" officer asked. "Can you tell me if Max's eyes are kind?" There was a long pause. Emma stared at the dog, really stared, studying Max's face with the intensity of a scientist examining data. Max, displaying the incredible patience that made him an exceptional police dog, simply sat beside his handler and looked back at the small girl with dark, intelligent, utterly non-threatening eyes. "Yes," Emma whispered. The word was so quiet it was almost inaudible, but it was a word. A real word spoken aloud to someone other than her mother in 6 weeks. The courtroom seemed to collectively gasp. Officer's face broke into a gentle smile. "Max's eyes are kind, aren't they? Because Max is a kind dog. Max is a good helper." Emma's hand, which had been extended and trembling, began to lower slightly. But instead of retreating, it began to move forward, millimeter by millimeter, inch by inch. Maria held her breath. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything that came next. The gap between Emma's small hand and Max closed from 10 feet to 8 feet, then to 6 feet. Emma was moving now, sliding off her mother's lap slightly, her legs beginning to work beneath her despite the overwhelming terror that still coursed through her system. "Slow and steady," officer encouraged. "You're doing something so brave, Emma, so brave." 4 feet away now. Emma's small hand was shaking so badly it looked like it might fall off, but she kept moving. Her breathing had become somewhat more regular, though it was still rapid. Her eyes remained fixed on Max's eyes, those kind, patient, non-threatening eyes. 3 feet. Maria had tears streaming down her face now, tears of pride and terror and hope all mingled together. She remained close enough to catch her daughter if she collapsed, but she gave Emma the space to do this herself. 2 feet. Emma was now close enough to touch the dog if she extended her arm fully. Max remained in his perfect sit-stay, his tail wagging slowly, his entire body language screaming that he meant no harm. "Go ahead, Emma," officer whispered. "You can touch him. Max would like that very much." Emma's hand trembled as it moved the final inches. Her small fingers, which had been clenched into a fist, began to open. And then, in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time, Emma's tiny hand made contact with Max's head. The moment lasted for only a second, but it contained an eternity of transformation. Emma had crossed the barrier. She had faced her trauma and had not been destroyed by it. And then she looked up at officer, at her mother, at judge, and her expression transformed into something that transcended fear. Time seemed to suspend itself in that impossible moment. Emma's small fingers made contact with Max's soft fur, and the world held its breath. 6 weeks of silence, 6 weeks of trauma, 6 weeks of a little girl locked away in her own terrified mind, all of it condensed into this single instant of connection. The texture of Max's coat was nothing like Emma remembered. She had expected roughness, aggression, danger. Instead, she felt warmth. She felt softness. She felt something living and present and fundamentally non-threatening. Her small hand remained on the dog's head, barely touching, as if she was afraid that increased pressure might cause him to transform into the frightening creature from her nightmares. But Max didn't transform. Max simply remained, patient and gentle, his tail continuing its slow, steady wag. Officer didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything to interrupt this sacred moment. He simply sat beside his dog and bore witness to a small child beginning to reclaim her world. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to deepen. The panic that had gripped her chest started to loosen its stranglehold. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, began to relax incrementally. She stared at her own hand resting on Max's head like she couldn't quite believe it was real, like she was afraid that if she looked away, she might wake up and discover this had all been a dream. Then something miraculous happened. Emma's mouth opened. Her small throat worked. And for the first time in 6 weeks that felt like 6 years to everyone in that courtroom, words emerged. Not the words everyone had been waiting for, not an account of violence or trauma or the incident that had silenced her. Instead, from Emma's small mouth came 2 simple words, spoken in a clear, steady voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her that had remained untouched by trauma. "Good dog." The courtroom erupted. Not in a chaotic or disruptive way, but in a release of emotion so profound that it was almost primal. Judge removed her glasses entirely and covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The court stenographer abandoned her keyboard and wept openly, her face in her hands. Stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward, and she covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face like a broken dam. But the most important reaction came from Maria. Maria collapsed to her knees beside her daughter, her entire body racked with sobs. She wrapped her arms around Emma and held her so tightly it seemed like she might never let go. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking into fragments. "Oh, my baby, my baby, my baby. I'm so proud of you, so incredibly, impossibly proud." Emma, still touching Max's head, turned her body to lean into her mother's embrace. She was crying now too, not the silent, gasping sobs of panic but real tears, the kind that came from genuine emotion processing itself. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder while continuing to keep one hand on Max, as if the dog was an anchor keeping her tethered to this moment of breakthrough. Officer's own eyes were wet with tears. He reached down and stroked Max's head, whispering something to his dog that only the animal could hear. Max's tail wagged with increased enthusiasm, as if the dog understood that he had just participated in something profoundly important. It took several minutes for the room to regain any semblance of composure. Judge replaced her glasses, composed herself with visible effort, and then looked directly at Maria and Emma with an expression of such profound compassion that it seemed to radiate across the room. "Emma," Judge said gently, her own voice thick with emotion, "I heard what you said, and I want you to know that you just did something incredibly brave, something that I will never, ever forget. Do you understand?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she nodded slightly against her mother's shoulder. She was still crying, still shaking, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. The barrier had been breached. The silence had been broken. Over the following hours, as Maria remained with Emma in a private waiting room, the legal machinery began to move in ways that reflected the profound impact of what had occurred. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Mitchell met with the defense team. Judge issued a ruling that Emma's testimony, given in a therapeutic context with appropriate accommodations and support structures, would be admissible in the trial. But more importantly, something else happened. Emma began to speak. Slowly at first, tentatively, but with increasing confidence as the hours passed. Doctor, who had been called to the courthouse to provide immediate therapeutic support, sat with Emma and Maria and simply listened as Emma began to recount her experience. Not in response to leading questions or legal procedures, but in response to genuine human connection and the knowledge that her voice mattered, that her words had power. Emma described the shouting, the scary sounds, the dog barking, which she now understood was the dog trying to help, not trying to hurt. She described her uncle's angry face and her aunt's frightened voice. She described the moment when everything became too much and her mind had decided to stop speaking, a protective mechanism that her 3-year-old psyche had activated to survive. But now, with Max's presence as a symbol of redemption and safety, Emma's voice had returned. 2 weeks later, Roberto stood trial. Emma, not in the traditional courtroom setting where the trauma would have been, but in a modified environment with her mother present, with Doctor present, and with Max lying peacefully on a cushion visible from where Emma sat. The defense attorney, James, was noticeably more restrained in his cross-examination than he would have been in a normal case. Even he seemed to recognize that to aggressively challenge a traumatized 3-year-old who had just overcome 6 weeks of selective mutism would be a moral violation of the highest order. Emma's clear, steady testimony corroborated its account in every significant detail. She described the violence, the fear, the moment when the police and Max arrived, and she spoke with a clarity and credibility that no jury could discount. Roberto was convicted on all charges. He received 5 years in prison. But the real victory extended far beyond the courtroom. In the months following the trial, Emma began to heal in ways that seemed almost miraculous to those who had witnessed her trauma. She returned to preschool, initially hesitant but gradually regaining confidence. She restarted her singing, though her voice was initially quieter than before. She began to laugh again, though sometimes the sound came with a slightly uncertain quality, as if she was remembering how to do it. And she formed an unlikely friendship with Max. Officer began bringing the dog to Emma's preschool once a month for a therapeutic visitation program. Emma would greet Max with unbridled joy, hugging the dog and whispering secrets into his ear. She had named a stuffed animal Max and carried him everywhere. She drew pictures of the dog with hearts and stars surrounding it. The case became a landmark in how courts across the country approached traumatized child witnesses. Legal journals published articles about the innovative therapy-based approach. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar programs, bringing trained dogs into courtrooms to help traumatized children bridge the gap between survival and testimony. But for Maria and Emma, the most important outcome wasn't legal or procedural. It was personal. It was the return of her daughter's voice. It was the knowledge that Emma had faced her deepest fear and had not been destroyed by it. It was the understanding that healing was possible, that trauma could be processed and survived, that a small girl and a police dog could teach an entire legal system something about courage and compassion. On the first anniversary of that day in the courtroom, Emma stood beside Max at a press conference where Judge announced the Emma Protocol, a nationwide framework for using therapeutic animals to support traumatized child witnesses in legal proceedings. When asked how she felt about the program being named after her, Emma, now 4 years old, confident and articulate once more, looked up at Officer and smiled. "Good dog," she said clearly, reaching down to stroke Max's head. And in those 2 words, spoken with the freedom and joy of a child who had reclaimed her voice and her power, the entire room understood the true meaning of healing. The end.